this country is gearing up for a new president. But first, we are going to begin on Capitol Hill, where the United States Senate will soon kick off a series of high-stakes confirmation hearings for President-elect Biden's top cabinet nominees. Lawmakers will question his picks to lead the State Department, Treasury, Pentagon, and Homeland Security, along with the Director of National Intelligence. However, there are growing concerns that Mr. Biden could take office tomorrow without any confirmed cabinet members. The Senate will have to juggle these confirmation hearings with President Trump's second impeachment trial. It remains unclear exactly when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will deliver the single article to the upper chamber to begin that process. This all comes as President Trump wraps up his 4 years in office by gearing up to issue a long list of pardons and commutations. We're waiting to find out who will be directly affected by this, but a source tells CBS News the president is not expected to pardon himself. Meanwhile, more than 20,000 National Guard troops are pouring into our nation's capital to secure President-elect Biden's historic inauguration tomorrow. We will have full coverage of all these major headlines throughout the morning. But first, let's begin with Weijia Jiang in Wilmington, Delaware, where Mr. Biden is gearing up to take office.
CBS News got an inside look at the inaugural platform and the view from President-elect Biden's lectern, where he will deliver the most important speech of his career. Louisiana Congressman Cedric Richmond will serve as a top advisor in the West Wing.
I think he's going to share his vision for the country. He is the president for all of America, and he's going to govern that way.
To govern, Mr. Biden will need a team. Today, Senate confirmation hearings will start for 5 of his cabinet picks to lead the Departments of State, Treasury, Defense, and Homeland Security, along with the Director of National Intelligence. In her opening remarks obtained by CBS News, Secretary of Treasury nominee Janet Yellen will call for major financial actions now to prevent a long-term scarring of the economy later.
We're going into Wednesday knowing that we're ready to do the work.
The transition has been tense, with far less coordination than usual between the Trump and Biden teams. In yet another sign, last night President Trump issued a proclamation that would lift COVID-related travel restrictions for much of Europe and Brazil, places where the virus is still spreading. The Biden administration quickly rejected the move. Mr. Biden's incoming press secretary tweeted, "The administration does not intend to lift these restrictions. In fact, we plan to strengthen public health measures around international travel in order to further mitigate the spread of COVID-19.
All right, so Weijia Jiang is joining us now from Wilmington, Delaware, to talk more about all of this. Already, the Biden administration is very busy. Talk about hitting the ground running. So let's start with these Senate confirmation hearings for President-elect Biden's cabinet nominees. A number of these individuals, members of the Senate would be very familiar with. They have worked, within the Capitol for many, many years. What is the expectation? Will Biden have some confirmations by the time he takes office tomorrow?
Well, we really don't know because, these hearings take time depending on how many questions these senators have and how many controversies may be attached to the nominees. And so even though there's a chance that he could have 1 or 2 of these picks confirmed by tomorrow, there's also a good chance that the president-elect begins his term with all acting secretaries and not a permanent one, because, again, we have to see what kind of political gridlock may surface and how that will impact the nominations. But these are really critical positions, including the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Treasury Secretary. I mean, we are facing a ravaged economy, and she is expected, that is Janet Yellen, to urge lawmakers to pass Mr. Biden's economic relief package as soon as possible, because she says if we don't, as you heard in my piece, it really could have a long-term impact. And then you have to look at the other nominees, too, and what sorts of lines of questionings they will face. And I can tell you that probably the most controversial pick here is for the Department of Defense. This is Lloyd Austin, and he has only been retired for 4 years. So not only would he have to get confirmed, but he would have to get a waiver to be able to serve in this role, which is not new. It is not ordinary, but, it has happened before. In fact, President Trump's pick of James Mattis had to receive something similar as well because he was also recently retired. So again, you just never know what's going to come up at these hearings, and it's going to take time. So we'll have to see if any of them can receive a rapid confirmation.
And Weijia, as you know, the Senate is also facing President Trump's second impeachment trial. While they're tackling these confirmation hearings, I know that we had reports that President-elect Biden had spoken to the outgoing Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, about the possibility of sort of doing a dual track where you're perhaps in the morning doing something with confirmation and in the afternoon doing the impeachment. What are you hearing is the latest?
Well, so far, we don't know exactly when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is going to send over that article of impeachment, so the process for the trial can begin. But we do expect it will be sooner than later. And you're right. The president-elect has acknowledged that senators have a lot going on. He has a legislative agenda that he wants to push through very quickly when it comes to a sweeping immigration bill, when it comes to that economic relief package we've talked about. And so, senators have to focus on that in addition to confirming not just the 5 nominees today, but the entire cabinet. So on top of that, you add an impeachment trial, and that's why Mr. Biden has said, we have to find a way to break up the work days for these senators so they can, do a little bit of everything. But you're right, his chief of staff has said that he and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell are in frequent contact, and they have a lot of straightforward conversations. So we'll have to see what that means with regard to setting up a schedule for these lawmakers.
Weijia, you brought up a couple of areas that where the president-elect has already sort of talked about what his plans are. Another very important thing for him to tackle is, of course, the coronavirus. He's already talked about, what he wants to do in the first 100 days when it comes to the vaccine. But what can you tell us about the president-elect plans when it comes to the coronavirus? And also, can you address what you brought up in your story about President Trump on his way out deciding to lift a travel ban that will go into effect days after he's already left office?
Right. So last night, we heard from the White House that a travel restriction on Brazil and many parts of Europe would be lifted on January 26th, which, as you mentioned, is after the president leaves office. But shortly after that, the Biden administration said, no, that's not going to happen. At that time, they'll be in charge. And the press secretary, the incoming press secretary, I should say, contradicted what we heard from the current White House, because she says, the way that the virus continues to rage around the world, they're actually going to be even more strict when it comes to measures to keep Americans safe. As for your other question, the president-elect has been clear that vaccinations are key, and that's why he's focused on getting 100 million doses out in his first 100 million days. And in order to do that, you have to have not only the infrastructure, but the people, which is why he wants to train 100,000 new workers to administer the shots and set up, vaccination sites all over the country, including mobile sites for rural areas where people might not have access to, a facility where they can go, because, getting protection, he believes, is the priority for trying to control the virus, in addition to more money for testing and helping schools to reopen. But, there's so much on his plate. And even though he is going full speed ahead and has, plans, executing those plans are a different story, especially when you have Congress that is so deeply divided.
Let's talk about another plan, Weijia. We've learned that the president-elect is set to propose a major bill and use executive action when it comes to immigration shortly after taking office. I filed a report this morning on CBS This Morning showing this growing caravan in Central America that is trying to make its way to the United States. And generally, these types of things happen when people believe that there might be some type of change coming to immigration laws in the United States. What can you tell us about it?
Well, you're right, but there's only so much a president can do with regard to executive action, which is exactly why Mr. Biden is trying to roll back some of the president's measures. Because one thing that President Trump did not accomplish, even though it was one of his campaign promises, was passing a sweeping immigration reform package, and he has not done that. Instead, he used a series of executive actions to implement new programs. But you're right, President-elect Biden plans to introduce in the very first days of his office a broad, sweeping plan that could create a path to citizenship for millions of immigrants who are currently living in the U.S. without legal status. And he'll also make it easier for people to seek asylum along the U.S.-Mexico border. As you know now, they have to wait in a third country because of what's called the Remain in Mexico policy for the Trump administration, because President Trump spoke at length about what he calls catch and release and did not want people waiting in the U.S. for their court dates to see whether they could stay here. And he also, Mr. Biden, that is, plans to extend and fully implement all protections for the so-called dreamers, who are those young immigrants who came here when they were minors, so they have a path to citizenship and protections from deportation. And so we'll have to see whether Mr. Biden is successful in passing legislation, but he is certainly committed to it, because he has talked at length before about why it's so important to welcome immigrants, since it is a piece of who we are. It is who we are, I should say, as a country.
Indeed it is. Weijia Jiang for us. Thank you, Weijia, as always. We appreciate it.
Sure.